From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The doctor is the one who has the responsibility to document if a death was an indirect cause from Hurricane Maria. What was the cause? He died because there was no electricity.
Puerto Rico's governor calls for a recount of the death toll from Hurricane Maria. The government's official toll, 64. But several investigations have revealed nearly 1,000 more people died. We'll go to San Juan to speak with the co-founder of the Center for Investigative Journalism, who originally broke the story. Then, as Congress votes on the tax bill, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights says the Trump administration and Republicans are turning the U.S. into the world champion of extreme inequality.
I've just finished a 2-week trip across the United States from California to Puerto Rico looking at poverty and its relationship to civil rights for the United Nations. What I found was incredibly low rates of social mobility. So the people who are now very rich will stay that way. People who are very poor will certainly stay that way. And what we've got with the new tax reform and the proposed welfare reforms is a great exacerbation on both ends of that scale.
We'll speak with UN Special Rapporteur Philip Alston. Then the CDC's 7 banned words: fetus, entitlement, vulnerable, diversity, transgender, evidence-based, and science-based. We'll speak with the CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Dr. Rush Holt, and Columbia University Gender Studies professor Jack Halberstam. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The House of Representatives is poised to pass a massive rewrite of the U.S. tax code today that will overwhelmingly benefit corporations and the wealthiest Americans. The bill would also end the federal health insurance mandate, endangering the Affordable Care Act, while opening up drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. On Capitol Hill, hundreds of protesters flooded the offices of lawmakers Monday in civil disobedience protests. Among those arrested was Cincinnati resident Megan Anderson, who uses a wheelchair and has a degenerative neuromuscular disease. Anderson says the tax bill will lead to Medicaid cuts that could shorten her life.
I am begging the people that work for us to not kill me. This disease continues to get worse. I will one day need a tracheotomy, a ventilator. Please allow me that so I can continue to laugh, continue to share tears of joy with my family, my friends, and my community.
The protests came as a new analysis by the Tax Policy Institute found that by 2027, the top 1% would get 83% of the tax cut, while 2/3 of middle-class Americans would see a tax increase. The Senate's expected to vote on final passage of the bill later this week. In Washington state, a high-speed passenger train on its inaugural trip from Seattle to Portland derailed on Monday, leaving at least 3 people dead and injuring 70 others, 10 of them seriously. Federal investigators say the Amtrak train was traveling at 80 miles per hour when it barreled off the tracks in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. The accident sent some of the train's cars tumbling onto a major highway below, with others left dangling on a steep embankment. This is West Pierce Fire Chief Jay Summerlin.
It took a lot of extrication tools. It wasn't easy for the firefighters to get through. They were using jaws of life. They were using air chisels and different forms of saws to be able to get into some of the crushed cars to get access to people and get them out. Some of the rescues were done by ladders. It was just a difficult place to be.
The National Transportation Safety Board says it's too early to tell what caused the derailment and that its investigators would spend a week or more scouring the wreckage for clues. Ahead of the crash, the mayor of the city of Lakewood raised safety concerns about the new rail line, predicting earlier this month it could lead to multiple deaths. The train was not utilizing positive train control, a technology mandated by Congress but rarely operating in Amtrak trains, which could have prevented the crash. After the crash, President Trump tweeted, quote, "The train accident that just occurred in DuPont, Washington shows more than ever Why our soon-to-be-submitted infrastructure plan must be approved quickly. $7 trillion spent in the Middle East while our roads, bridges, tunnels, railways, and more crumble. Not for long, Trump tweeted. In fact, President Trump's proposed budget for next year would cut federal funds for the Federal Transit Administration's capital investment program, including Amtrak projects. President Trump outlined his blueprint for national security Monday in a speech trumpeting U.S. military might, but failing to mention the threat posed by climate change. Trump's national security strategy calls for the U.S. to respond with nuclear weapons to non-nuclear attacks. Trump said he was seeking to put America first by expanding the U.S. military to counter the expanding power of Russia and China. The United States vetoed a United Nations Security Council resolution Monday calling on the Trump administration to withdraw its declaration that Jerusalem's Israel's capital. The vote was 14-1, with U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley exercising the lone veto. The Israeli military seized control of East Jerusalem in 1967 and has occupied the territory ever since. Palestinians, however, have long seen East Jerusalem as the capital of their future country, and both the UN Security Council and the General Assembly have passed dozens of resolutions calling for Israel to end its occupation of East Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Vice President Mike Pence has delayed a planned trip to the Middle East, saying he'll remain in Washington, D.C. to preside over passage of the Republican tax bill this week. Pence's announcement came after Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas canceled a planned meeting with Pence in Bethlehem and called for an angry demonstration to protest President Trump's decision on Jerusalem. Pence now says he'll visit Egypt and Israel in February. Honduran Vice President Ricardo Alvarez has rejected calls for a revote in the November 26 election after incumbent President Juan Orlando Hernández was declared the winner by the government-controlled election tribunal.
This is an autonomous and sovereign country. This is a country that is not going to do what anybody from an international organization tells it to do. I will say it again, the only other election this country will have, the next one, is on the last Sunday of November 2021. There's not another election.
Vice President Alvarez's comments came despite charges of voter fraud by opposition candidate Salvador Nasrallah and a call for a new vote by the Organization of American States, which said the first election was so filled with irregularities that it's impossible to declare a winner. Protests continue to rage across Honduras. In the capital, Tegucigalpa, Monday, police fired tear gas and pepper spray at protesters who burned tires and set up barricades in the streets. In Vienna, Austria, thousands of people rallied Monday to protest Austria's newly seated far-right government, which includes members of the Anti-Immigrant Freedom Party, which was founded after World War II by former members of the Nazi Party. Outside the presidential palace, police used water cannons to turn back protesters who chanted "Refugees welcome" and "Nazis out." This is protester Femme Fiscale.
I believe Austria should remain open. Clearly, we're a small country and can't take everyone in, but we should also avoid producing general suspects and being generally hostile to migrants and refugees.
Puerto Rico's government said Monday it's launching an official review of the death count from Hurricane Maria. The storm devastated the island September 20th, and since then the government's put the official death toll at 64, but a number of investigations have revealed nearly 1,000 more people died. This comes as the Center for Investigative Journalism in Puerto Rico reported this week that close to 3 months since the storm, 45 people are still listed as missing, and efforts by Puerto Rico's police to locate them have been minimal or almost non-existent. After headlines, we'll go to San Juan to speak with Puerto Rican journalist Amaya Sosa. One of President Trump's nominees to a lifetime appointment on the U.S. District Court in Washington has withdrawn from consideration after widely circulated video showed he was unable to answer basic questions about the law and had never tried a case in court. This is Louisiana Republican Senator John Kennedy questioning Peterson at a Senate Judiciary confirmation hearing last week.
Have you ever tried a jury trial?
I have not.
Civil?
No.
Criminal?
No.
Bench?
No.
State or federal court?
I have not.
Matthew Peterson's withdrawal came after the Judiciary Committee rejected 2 of President Trump's other nominees this month. Texas lawyer Jeff Mateer, who has called transgender children evidence of Satan's plan, and blogger Brett Talley, who was rated unanimously unqualified for a judicial post by the American Bar Association. In California, federal appeals court judge Alex Kozinski said Monday he'll retire after at least 15 women accused him of sexual harassment, unwanted hugging, kissing, or groping, an incident spanning decades. Judge Kozinski was appointed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals by President Ronald Reagan in 1985. Current and former women contributors at the Fox News Channel are speaking out against sexual abuse in the workplace after media mogul and Fox News owner Rupert Murdoch dismissed widespread charges of rape, sexual assault, and harassment at the network as nonsense. Murdoch made the comments in an interview on the Sky News Channel, which he founded.
How harmful has the whole raft of allegations about sexual harassment at Fox News been for the business?
It's all nonsense. There was a problem with our chief executive, over the years, but isolated instance. As soon as we investigated, he was out of the place in hours. Well, 3 or 4 days. And there's been nothing else since then.
In fact, it took Fox News 3 weeks to force out its former chief executive, Roger Ailes, after former host Gretchen Carlson filed suit against Ailes and left with a $40 million settlement. Ailes was also accused of sexual harassment by more than 20 other women. Rupert Murdoch also failed to mention the case of former news host Bill O'Reilly, who settled sexual harassment claims with at least 6 women, paying out $32 million to settle one suit alone before he was eventually fired last April. Fox News host Eric Bolling was suspended by the network in August over accusations he texted unwanted photos of his genitals to female coworkers, and former TV commentator Scotty Nell Hughes says in a lawsuit she was raped by longtime anchor Charles Payne and then coerced into maintaining a sexual relationship with him. And feminist activist Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement, will preside over the ceremonial countdown ringing in 2018 on New Year's Eve in New York City's Times Square. 10 years ago, Tarana Burke began Me Too as a grassroots movement to aid sexual assault survivors in underprivileged communities where rape crisis centers and sexual assault workers were not going. In a statement, the president of the Times Square Alliance said, quote, "Tarana Burke's courage and foresight have changed the world this year, and we hope forever." To see our interviews with Tarana Burke, you can go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin today's show in Puerto Rico, where the island's governor said Monday he is launching an official recount and review of the death count from Hurricane Maria. The storm devastated the island on September 20th, and since then, the government has listed the official death toll at 64. But several investigations have calculated that perhaps nearly 1,000 more people died. The Center for Investigative Journalism in Puerto Rico examined the 40-day period after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and compared it to that same time period last year, finding at least 985 additional people died. A CNN survey of funeral home directors in Puerto Rico found that they had tracked at least 499 additional deaths in the first month after the storm that were attributable to Hurricane Maria. This week, the New York Times and other outlets published statistics from the Puerto Rican government that show the death toll may be more than 1,000. In a statement released Monday, the island's governor, Ricardo Rosselló, referred to the report, saying the media, quote, used the data provided by the Puerto Rican Demographic Registry, but the government needs to investigate if the increase of the deaths is related directly or indirectly with Hurricane Maria. In the face of mounting evidence of a vast undercount by the government, Governor Rosselló added, quote, "We always expected that the number of hurricane-related deaths would increase as we receive more factual information, not hearsay, and this review will ensure we are correctly counting everybody."
This comes as the Center for Investigative Journalism in Puerto Rico reported this week that close to 3 months since the storm, 45 people are still listed as missing, and efforts by Puerto Rico's police to locate them have been minimal or almost non-existent. Meanwhile, Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen and Housing and Urban Development Secretary Ben Carson are visiting the island today where at least a third of residents are still without power and hundreds remain in shelters. The visit follows a proposal Monday night by Republican House lawmakers for an $81 billion disaster aid package for recovery efforts in Puerto Rico, Texas, Florida, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, as well as states hit by wildfires, well more than President Trump has asked for. For more, we go to San Juan, Puerto Rico, where we're joined by Amaya Sosa, the co-founder of Puerto Rico's Center for Investigative Journalism, where she's a reporter. Her latest article headline, "Delayed and Without Resources, Puerto Rico's Police Did Little to Investigate Missing Persons After Hurricane Maria." Welcome to Democracy Now!, Amaya Sosa. We had on the Center for Investigative Journalism, your center, early on after the hurricane, where you were alleging that there were around 1,000 deaths. This is now months later. At the time, President Trump was touting the fact that the death level was very low. Now the governor of Puerto Rico says he's calling for a recount. Tell us the evidence you have that the death toll may well be around 1,000.
First of all, hi, Amy. Good morning. Good morning, Juan. Thanks so much for having me with you. You know, early on, since week number 1 or 2, we already had a lot of evidence that the deaths were skyrocketing, and they were much higher than the 16 death count the government maintained as the official death toll for like 2 weeks. That didn't move at all any day for 2 weeks. So certainly there was very little interest of the government of being proactive and finding out what was really going on. The morgues at the hospitals were full in Puerto Rico, which is not normal. They were saying, the hospitals were saying this was the fact that this was going on. And the government was just didn't want to get into the issue and count what was going on. Curiously, this went on until the day President Trump came here and used that number to say, you know what, this is not a real catastrophe. This is not like Katrina. And that same day, hours after, the number doubled, the official number.
Well, I want to turn to those comments you're referring to Donald Trump made in October during his visit to Puerto Rico after the hurricane hit the island. Throughout the trip, he repeatedly praised his administration's response to the storm and comparing it to George W. Bush's handling of Katrina in 2005. This is what the president said.
If you look at a real catastrophe like Katrina, and you look at the tremendous hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that died, and you look at what happened here with really a storm that was just totally overpowering. Nobody's ever seen anything like this. What is your death count as of this moment? 17?
16 certified.
16 people certified. 16 people versus in the thousands. You can be very proud of all of your people, all of our people working together.
Amaya Sosa, your response, especially given the fact that here you have the governor of the island as well as the president of the United States, both apparently not in contact with what was actually happening on the ground at that time.
You know what? That was a very sad moment. Everybody here knew that was not real. We have been publishing already for 1 week some of our stories and our investigations, and the government knew that was not the real number. They've said over and over again, repeatedly, still now that they're saying they're going to do the recount, that they had not received information. They don't have to receive information. They have to go look for the information, go out and investigate, and they just haven't done that.
You know.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you in terms of the efforts of people on the ground to try to get a clearer sense. One of the things that's been raised that the hospitals were never giving any kind of protocols by the government about how to deal with deaths that were coming in at that time. Can you talk about the medical community, what they were told?
They were just sent an email, maybe 2 or 3 emails with the CDC guidelines of how to manage, or recommendations on how to manage death certificates under these natural disasters like hurricanes, for example. But those were, never distributed. They are not a mandate. The hospital said that that's not their legal responsibility, and as we all know, there's a lot of liability in writing, putting things in writing without a law or an executive order mandating that. So certainly no. A month ago, there were only, I think, 3 death certificates that said the word hurricane. So there was no clear instruction. This was just to the administrators of the hospital. And I've spoken to many doctors that have said that they have never received these guidelines. They never received an order. And when the governor has wanted to make something happen, he just stands up and clearly says he's putting out an executive order or some kind of mandate, and that hasn't happened. Today is the first time, it was the first time that he says something clearly about this issue, 3 months after.
In October, Democracy Now! Traveled to Puerto Rico to cover the aftermath of the hurricane. I spoke with San Juan Mayor Carmen Yulín Cruz, who raised the issue of the number of bodies cremated after the storm.
Reported that 911 deaths have been, or bodies have been cremated since Maria. Why is that happening? 911. Why is that happening? We have no idea. You know, usually when you cremate people at that rate, it's because you're trying to ensure that an outbreak of whatever disease doesn't come out. But whatever it is, we should know about it. And again, I don't understand why these things are not being openly talked about.
So that's San Juan Mayor Carmen Yulín Cruz. Amaya Sosa, can you respond to this, the number of cremations?
Well, the number of cremations is certainly high. It's been put a little out of context because it wasn't in the stories that came out. They were stories in the States. They didn't compare it to months before, but certainly it's high. Usually it's like 400 to 500 cremations, monthly cremations, and now it was about 900, so it almost doubled. The person in charge, Security Secretary Hector Pesquera, has said that this is the will of the people. But I've spoken to a lot of people that say we have no option. The bodies of my family member, for example, were already decomposed. So, you know, it's not that I asked for or I wished for a cremation. I just had no other option. So certainly it all has to do with the situation. I cannot say there's a will to just cover up something, but certainly now to investigate when you've cremated so many bodies, it's very difficult.
Amaya, you've also reported about the spike in the number of people missing subsequent to the hurricane and the failure of police officials to even look for these folks. Could you talk about that as well?
Well, this is another very sad situation that happened and was just erased, forgotten by everybody. The week after the hurricane, the missing persons in Puerto Rico tripled, and as we just found out, the police kind of noticed 3 weeks after the fact. So as you should know, when there's a missing person, the first 48 hours are critical to finding this person, and the police couldn't react because of the situation. Also, the police was going through the same problems everybody in Puerto Rico was going through: no water, no electricity, no communications. But it's still the security force. You know, they should have known before, and now, 3 months after, you still have 45 persons from that period that remain missing, and we are noticing a profile of a lot of people with mental health problems. So that got disoriented. Family members are just super upset that they have not had any help from the police at all. So we published that on Sunday. We still haven't seen a reaction, but the police chief in Puerto Rico, Michelle Farley, said that you know, she's open to work in this situation. It's still the same problem. It's a little too late.
Can you comment on, Amaya Sosa, the significance of the heads of HUD, the Housing Urban Development, Dr. Ben Carson, as well as the head of the Department of Homeland Security coming to Puerto Rico today? What you think they need to know?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you very well.
Can you comment on the heads of the Homeland Security and Housing and Urban Development coming to Puerto Rico today? What do you think they need to know?
There's a lot of work for them if they're willing to do it. First of all, the Homeland Security Department is the one that has been asked by the Democratic delegation to investigate this issue with the deaths and the death count. The governor has said they will. He wants this issue to be investigated, and he wants a recount to be done. But as we published today, the people that will be in charge of that investigation are the same people that have been in charge for the past 3 months and that have been stubbornly saying that this is it, this is the correct number and they don't have to do anything else. So certainly that raises a lot of suspicion from our side and from people's side that don't trust the government in this issue, in this investigation. So I think the Homeland Security Acting Secretary should, take some kind of control and make some serious questions. And in terms of the Housing Secretary, that's one of the most serious issues we have right now. 250,000 people have lost their homes. There's a lot of people without a place to stay, still people at shelters sleeping. So certainly we have a serious housing crisis that must be attended to.
And I'm wondering if you could talk about the congressional response to the crisis in Puerto Rico. Obviously, there's a bill now being introduced for $81 billion, but that's not just for Puerto Rico. That's for Texas, for Florida, for the victims of the wildfires in California. When the island's governor had requested over $90 billion just for the island. And also how the tax bill that will be voted on in the next day or so is going to affect the island of Puerto Rico, because there are claims that some of the provisions would actually spur more companies to leave the island of Puerto Rico who now have manufacturing facilities there.
It's very frustrating. I mean, it seems like all the doors are being shut on Puerto Rico when the help is needed the most. We really don't understand why this tax bill cannot make the exception with Puerto Rico when we're going through such a dire crisis that everybody has seen on TV for the past 3 months. More than half of the people here still don't have electricity, and they want to tax the few companies that are left. The biggest crisis right now, besides the humanitarian crisis and the electricity, is the economic situation, the economic development. The businesses just cannot run without electricity, and many have just shut down. A lot of people don't have any options at all, and now the few options that have decided to stay and, fight the fight will see their taxes increase by 20%. It's really horrible. It's terrible. And in terms of the package, it's been very slow, and what can come out from that 81 billion package? What can be the final number that will be given to Puerto Rico that will be determinant to what can happen, how we can bounce back a little from this situation or not?
Omaya Sosa, we want to thank you so much for being with us, co-founder of Puerto Rico's Center for Investigative Journalism. We'll link to your latest piece. Headline, Delayed and Without Resources, Puerto Rico's police did little to investigate missing persons after Hurricane Maria. And a special thanks to where you are broadcasting from, WIPR, Public Television in San Juan, which, like many PBS stations, also plays Democracy Now! Daily. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll speak with Philip Alston, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. He just completed a 2-week tour around the United States, says the tax bill that the Republicans and Democrats in Congress are poised to vote on could devastate people in this country. Stay with us.
Sin rumbo, la energía negativa yo la derrumbo. con mis pezuñas de cordero. Me propuse a recorrer el continente entero, sin brújula, sin tiempo, sin agenda, inspirado por las leyendas, por historias empaquetadas en lata, por los cuentos que la luna relata. Aprendí a caminar sin mapa, a irme de caminata, sin comodidades, sin lujo, protegido por los santos y los brujos. Aprendí a escribir tirenorgas en mi libreta y con un mismo idioma sacudir todo el planeta. Aprendí que mi pueblo todavía reza porque la autoridades y la realeza todavía.
To the north by Puerto Rican artist Calle 13. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to a scathing new report on poverty in the United States that found the Trump administration and Republicans are turning the U.S. into the, quote, world champion of extreme inequality. Philip Alston, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, announced his findings after conducting a 2-week fact-finding mission across the country, including visits to California, Alabama, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. Alston also warned the Republican tax bill would transfer vast amounts of wealth to the richest earners while making life harder for the 41 million Americans living in poverty.
Among other startling findings in Alston's report, the U.S. ranks 36 in the world in terms of access to water and sanitation. Alston discussed the report's findings Friday with independent Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who focused on economic inequality during his presidential campaign. Well, for more, Philip Alston joins us here in our New York studio. He's the United Nations Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. He's also a professor at NYU Law School, New York University. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Professor Alston. So you just came back from this tour. Congress is poised to vote on this tax bill. Your assessment and why you're weighing in as the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty.
Well, my job is to try to highlight the extent to which the civil rights of people who are living in extreme poverty are jeopardized by government policies. What I see in the United States now is not just a tax reform bill, but a very clear indication by government officials with whom I met, by the Treasury and their analysis, that this is going to be funded in part by cuts to welfare, to Medicare, Medicaid. And so what you've got is a huge effort to enrich the richest and to impoverish the poorest. That is going to have very dramatic consequences.
And from what you saw, how did race and poverty overlap on this issue?
There's a very complex relationship, actually, between race and poverty. First, it is true that if you are African American, if you're Hispanic, your situation in terms of poverty is often going to be pretty bad. But there's also a racialized discourse where if you speak to policymakers, they will say, yes, we've got to cut back on welfare because those black families out there are really ripping off the system. And so what they do is to try to get some sort of race warfare going almost, that white voters think, yeah, I'm not going to be ripped off by the blacks and the Hispanics. But of course, the terrible thing is that the cuts are actually non-discriminatory. In other words, they impact the poor whites every bit as much as the poor people of color. So the race dimension is deeply problematic.
I wanted to turn to Benita Garner, a mother living in poverty who's participating in a program through a nonprofit called Lyft. She landed seasonal work with UPS, but worries what will happen when the job ends.
It's scary. It's something you don't really think about, but it's scary. It's just that I know it can happen. I'm like really not looking forward to the end of the month because I'm like, you know, right now you're getting money, but then it's like it's going to shut down again. So you always have to constantly think every day, what's my next move?
She spoke at your launch of your report. Talk about why Benita is so important.
Well, because there are millions of people in exactly that position. One of the things that the current administration is pushing is that we need to get people off welfare and into work. First of all, it's not clear that there are the jobs for people with those sort of skills. But secondly, those who do get the jobs that are available are going to end up in Benita's situation. I spoke with a lot of Walmart employees who are working full-time but who are still eligible for and totally dependent upon food stamps. So working 35 hours a week at Walmart is not enough to make a living out of. And there's a much bigger problem in the US, of course, the precariousness of employment as we move to the gig economy and so on, means that there are going to be ever more people in Vanita's situation where, yes, you get a job, yes, the benefits are cut, but you can't survive.
How does the U.S. compare to other countries in the world? I think most Americans would be shocked. I mean, we mentioned in the lead to this piece, the 36th in water quality in the world. Talk about comparing it to other major advanced, especially advanced industrial countries.
Well, the United States is, of course, one of the very richest countries in the world. But all of the statistics put it almost at the bottom. Doesn't matter what it is, whether it's child mortality rates, whether it's the longevity of adults, whether it's the degree of adequacy of health care, the United States is very close to the bottom on all of these. What's really surprising is that when I go to other countries, the big debate is, but we don't have the money. We can't afford to provide basic services to these people. And yet in the United States, they've got a trillion or $1.5 trillion to give to the very rich, but they also don't have any of the money to provide a basic lifestyle that is humane for 40 million Americans.
Professor Alston, you were in Alabama right around the time of the December 12th special election between Doug Jones and Roy Moore. And why were you talking about poverty at that time? Why did you see it as so significant weighing in this election?
I didn't weigh in the election. I was very careful not to do that.
No, why poverty weighs in.
Oh, right. Well, I think that, I mean, one of the best quotes I got during my 2-week visit was from an official in West Virginia, where voting rates are extremely low. And I said, why is it that no one votes in West Virginia? And the response was, well, you know, when people are very poor, they lose interest. They just don't believe there's any point. And of course, one begins to wonder if that's actually a strategy, that you make people poor enough, you make them obsessed with working out where their next meal is going to come from. They're not going to vote, and so you can happily ignore them.
You talked about a massive sewage crisis in rural Alabama, and also talked about meeting people there like Patty Mae Ainsley McDonald, who told you about how her house was shot up by white neighbors when she voted in 1965 after the Voting Rights Act became law.
Right. That was a very touching meeting. I was meeting with people who really are struggling to make it, but the main focus was actually on water and sanitation. What's shocking is that in a country like India today, there's a huge government campaign to try to get sewerage to all people, make it available. In Alabama and West Virginia, where I went, I asked state officials, so what's the coverage of the official sewerage system? I don't know. Really? So what plans?
That's what they said to you. They didn't know.
So what plans do you have then for extending the coverage, albeit slowly? None. So do you think people can live a decent life if they don't have access to sewerage? If the sewage is pouring out into the front garden, which is what I saw in a lot of these places, that's their problem. If they need it, they can buy it for themselves. In Alabama, where the soil, yeah, in Alabama, where the soil is very tough, it can cost up to $30,000 to put in your own septic system.
I wanted to ask you about Puerto Rico, which is grappling with a $74 billion debt and as much as $100 billion in storm damage. The Republican tax bill includes a 20% excise tax on goods produced there. This is Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, originally from Puerto Rico, talking about that.
Now, with the potential passage of the Republican tax scam bill, Puerto Rico faces an economic hurricane. Under this bill, American subsidiaries operating in Puerto Rico will now face a 20% tax when they move their goods off the island. If this becomes law, you can expect to see more than 200,000 manufacturing jobs disappear from the island. And the government of Puerto Rico could lose 1/3 of its revenue.
You visited Puerto Rico during your trip. The idea that even with an unemployment rate that hovers around 16, 17% depression levels, that there could be even greater unemployment as a result of this tax bill?
Puerto Rico is getting what it deserves. In other words, you don't have any votes in the Congress, you don't get anything. There's just no willingness on the part of members of Congress to be seen to be giving anything to Puerto Rico. The result is you've got extremely high levels of people on welfare, but those welfare payments are significantly lower than they are on the mainland. You've got a whole series of measures that are being proposed in the tax bill and elsewhere, and you've got the PROMESA, the Fiscal Oversight Board, poised to really impose a draconian austerity package. So the situation is grim, but when you don't have democratic representation, it's very hard to defend yourself.
The New York Times has a piece, The Next Crisis for Puerto Rico, a crush of foreclosures. And it says now Puerto Rico is bracing for another blow, a housing meltdown that could far surpass the worst of the foreclosures crisis that devastated Phoenix, Las Vegas, Southern California, South Florida. If the current numbers hold, Puerto Rico is headed for a foreclosure epidemic that could rival what happened in Detroit, where abandoned homes became almost as plentiful as occupied ones. Professor Alston.
So what you've got is the very poor, and I visited a lot of areas where people have no electricity still and are living in rubble, essentially. They won't be going anywhere. They'll be staying in their homes. Those who are reasonably well off will be fleeing because they can't make it in Puerto Rico. They don't have the electricity, they don't have the economic support, and so there's no point in staying. That housing market will then be terribly uninteresting for investors and others.
Could you talk about the positive side of your report, those areas that you saw communities organizing themselves and trying to deal with their problems directly?
Well, I did, and particularly in Puerto Rico, it has to be said. I visited some of the cooperatives where people are really trying to reclaim the land in San Juan, trying to dredge the old canal that's grown over. I met with a lot of people living around power plants who are very severely impacted by the daily flow of coal ash and so on. They're really organized, they're really focused, and that was terrific. I think in many other parts of the country as well, what I saw was, community health collectives in West Virginia. I saw the homeless in Skid Row and Los Angeles and so on. There is a real element of organization. But the bottom line, unfortunately, is that if you don't have essential government services being provided, these people can't do it on their own.
Well, we want to thank you very much for being with us. In 30 seconds, can you summarize? I mean, you're not from this country. You've lived here for a long time, but you now take this different kind of tour, and you're the special rapporteur on extreme poverty. Your thoughts on the United States after this 2 weeks?
Well, the United States is unique. First of all, it doesn't recognize what we call as social rights at the international level, a right to health care, a right to housing, a right to food. The United States is unique in that, saying these are not rights. Second, the issue with elimination of poverty always is around resources. We don't have the money. The United States, again, uniquely, has the money. It could eliminate poverty overnight if it wanted to. What we're seeing now is the classic. It's a political choice. Where do you want to put your money? Into the very rich or into creating a decent society which will actually be economically more productive than just giving the money to those who already have a lot?
And what the tax bill does?
That's what the tax bill does, from what I've seen.
Philip Alston, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, a professor at New York University Law School, just completed a 2-week tour examining extreme poverty and human rights in the U.S. When we come back, the 7 banned words, according to staff at the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. Is this true, that people at the CDC, when writing up budgets, are not supposed to use words like transgender or science-based, or use the word fetus? Stay with us. A Wall by Downtown Boys from the new album Cost of Living. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we end today's show looking at the controversy around a decision reportedly taken by the Trump administration to bar top federal health officials from using 7 words or phrases relating to abortion, sexuality, and science in official documents. The Washington Post broke the news Friday, citing an anonymous whistleblower who says policy analysts at the Centers for Disease Control were told of the banned words at a meeting last week. The words are fetus, entitlement, vulnerable, diversity, transgender, evidence-based, and science-based. In some cases, the analysts were reportedly given replacement phrases to use instead.
After widespread criticism of the purported ban, on Sunday, the CDC director, Dr. Brenda Fitzgerald, took to Twitter to refute the Washington Post report in a series of tweets saying no such ban had been proposed, adding, quote, CDC remains committed to our public health mission as a science and evidence-based institution. There was some confusion about whether the alleged directive was issued by the CDC or its parent agency, Health and Human Services.
In another tweet, Fitzgerald cited an HHS comment on the report saying, quote, the assertion that HHS has banned words is a complete mischaracterization of discussions regarding the budget formulation process. HHS will continue to use the best scientific evidence available to improve the health of all Americans. Well, for more, we're joined now by 2 guests. Dr. Rush Holt is the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and executive publisher of the Science family of journals. He's a research physicist, educator, and former politician. Dr. Holt represented Central New Jersey in Congress from 1999 to 2015. Also with us is Jack Halberstam, professor of English and Gender Studies at Columbia University. Their most recent book is titled Trans, a quick and quirky account of gender variability. Welcome both of you to Democracy Now! I'd like to start with Dr. Holt. Your response to this amazing report by the Washington Post and then the response by CDC.
Well, you know, at first glance, it's a farce, this idea of banning a few words. Now, as you said, the government agencies have said, well, that's not really true. It's a mischaracterization, which, of course, itself is a euphemism that seems to say they don't really mean what they say. So it actually has a serious side. And the serious side is it appears that ideology is being elevated above evidence. So they say these terms such as fetus and transgender and diversity are politically loaded words, and those are to be avoided. Now, they say they're not really banning their use. They just don't want to offend the congressional appropriators. And if they want their appropriations approved by Congress, they should avoid such words. But that in itself is elevating ideology above evidence. And science-based agencies in particular, but I would argue all agencies, should put a premium, the highest premium, on evidence-based thinking. And or, in other words, science-based thinking. Science is not just gadgets or expensive lab equipment. It's this way of thinking so we get our best sense of how things actually are. That's how you should begin making policy. That's how you should begin making regulations, and with a sense of how things actually are.
We're also joined by Jack Halberstam, professor of English and Gender Studies at Columbia University. So, Professor Halberstam, transgender and fetus. Don't use those words, apparently, the staff were told. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty Orwellian measure to try to take words out of potential health policies that differentially affect marginalized populations. The category of transgender is super interesting in this context because you might have expected LGBT, a much more blanket and umbrella term. So I think the focus on transgender has to be understood in terms of the Trump administration's sense that transgender is a category that requires some kind of medical intervention. And this was also the reason that Trump gave for wanting to ban transgender people in the military, was that this would be an enormous cost on the military to be funding sex reassignment surgeries and so on. So it's a kind of transactional relationship to the category of transgender.
And what does it mean not to use the word? Can you talk about the importance of naming?
Yeah, to not use that word is in a way to try to wish it out of existence, or to imply that it's a fictitious category that has been created by social justice activists as opposed to being an actual experience of a body. So I think this calling out of transgender in particular requires special attention, you know, because this is clearly a targeted word for the Trump administration at a moment when we're actually having a public conversation about gender diversity, bathroom use, and so on.
You've referred to the Trump administration in the past as being characterized by aggrieved white masculinity. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I think that these kinds of policies seem to suggest that certain people are getting special entitlements, that vulnerable populations, to use the words that they're using, are somehow receiving special treatment, and this allows Trump to speak to his potentially white male base and say these kinds of social justice measures are in the end going to be detrimental to your welfare, your economic well-being, your health, and so on. So it's a sort of zero-sum approach to healthcare, to the economy, and so on, that suggests to white men in particular, but also white women, that any kinds of measures that benefit marginalized populations will negatively influence them.
And the word fetus.
Fetus is, you know, so clearly a category that they believe is part of a left-wing ideology to not talk about unborn babies as babies. So if they can ban the word fetus, I presume they think that they will shed light upon the actual meaning of abortion, which, you know, for the right wing is equated with murder and killing and so on. So these kinds of words are so important, and as we saw in the AIDS crisis, to remove words from the vocabulary of healthcare professionals is very, very often to deny healthcare to vulnerable populations.
And Dr. Holt, I'd like to ask you, you're the chief executive of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. You and 15 other science society heads requested a meeting earlier this year with EPA head Scott Pruitt. What happened?
Well, nothing. And thanks, Juan, for asking that. It's we've been reaching out to this administration and, of course, to previous administrations to urge that all policies start with evidence-based thinking. You can bring your values in, you can bring your other perspectives in, but first you have to start with an understanding of how things actually are. Mr. Pruitt, the head of the EPA, when he was in Oklahoma, was constantly disparaging climate science. In fact, he denied that it was a science. And he said, well, we don't really know enough. There's a debate about this. And therefore we won't even look at it, we won't even consider it. Well, in fact, if he thinks there's a debate, all the more reason that he should be open to the collection of evidence, the study of the science. He has, at EPA, also restricted scientists from sitting on science advisory committees for what he calls conflict of interest, even though he willingly and frequently lets corporate people sit on those committees and ignores any possible conflict of interest there.
I mean, so you have also President Trump yesterday outlining his blueprint for national security in a speech trumpeting U.S. military might, but failing to mention the threat posed by climate change, something the Pentagon knows very well, has put it forward as a major national security threat.
Yes, Amy, the president relegated climate change to something he called energy dominance, the energy dominance section of his national security presentation. In other words, not as a legitimate science that should be studied, not as a threat to international stability. It is this idea of wishing things away. And wishful thinking and ideology, and by ideology I just mean pre-baked opinions that one holds dearly, those are the enemies of good policy and good regulation. And the antidote for that is evidence-based thinking. Now, it's not clear what the CDC folks said you couldn't say about evidence-based thinking, but the fact that the subject only comes up in response to outcry from employees there at CDC that they were being muzzled suggests to me that they have not elevated evidence-based thinking to their highest priority.
And you said that it's not just the Trump administration, although they may be the most extreme, but that previous administrations, you've had questions about what they've done in terms of dealing with evidence-based or science-based thinking.
You know, I would argue that for some decades, the American people have retreated somewhat from evidence-based thinking. However fascinated they are by science, however approving they appear to be when questioned about science, they don't show much attention. They're negligent, and policymakers are too, in their approach to science. The first question that every citizen should ask, as well as every policymaker should ask when confronting a regulation or a policy is, what's the evidence? And that's what it means to think like a scientist. You know, I'm not arguing that all Americans should wear lab coats, but all Americans should have this, well, let's call it empirical approach, which I think is a long-standing American characteristic that has been eroding.
A former federal official who spoke anonymously to the New York Times called the move stupid and Orwellian, but said, quote, they're not saying to not use the words in reports or articles or scientific publications or anything else the CDC does. They're saying not to use it in your request for money because it'll hurt you. It's not about censoring what CDC can say to the American public. It's about a budget strategy to get funded. Now, Dr. Rush Holt, you were a congressman. Jack Halberstam, you're a professor. You apply to the government, I assume, for government funding. The significance of this. They're not saying it's an overall ban. They're just saying if you want to get any money, don't use these words.
Right.
Well, as I say, that is primarily a bow to ideology.
And which has the effect of suppressing the exact kinds of health projects that people might submit that are based and are in relationship to people of color, queer people, women. Those are the targeted groups in that list, and it's a very, or not very subtle way of saying we don't particularly care about delivering complex health care to those
We
people.
have to leave it there. We thank you so much, Dr. Jack Halberstam of Columbia University and Dr. Rush Holt of the American Association for the Advancement of Science.